Hi, I'm Clara. At the auction, my mother looked straight past me and told her friends, "She's just here to clean." They all laughed. No one knew the $5,800,000, 0 cents painting they were fawning over was mine. Her words were a public humiliation, stripping away years of my unseen struggle. They didn't forget me, they erased me. But when I stepped forward with the proof they couldn't deny, the room went dead silent. The moment I reclaimed my truth, their smug facades crumbled under the weight of their lies. You ever watched people realize they built their status on a lie? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever been erased by your own family? I remember the way the snow crunched under my boots that night in January 2024. It was the kind of cold that slid down your sleeves, no matter how tightly you wrapped your coat. I had stitched the dress myself. Midnight blue silk with long sleeves and a hem that brushed the top of my shoes. Nothing fancy, just enough to say I came prepared. New Orleans. LA and January had a way of making you feel like you didn't belong unless you wore diamonds or carried a last name that meant something. Mine didn't. Not anymore. At the entrance of the Bourbon auction house, the glass doors reflected nothing but status. People stepping out of town cars, women in high heels that probably cost more than my rent. Their laughter loud, practiced. I walked alone, gripping a worn black clutch I'd inherited from a neighbor back when I lived in Savannah, GA. It still smelled faintly of lavender oil and old paper. The check-in desk was manned by a tall man in a tuxedo who looked through me before I even opened my mouth. "Name?" he asked, not looking up. "Clara Bennett," I said, steady. He clicked, scanned, frowned. "There's no one by that name on the list." I pulled out my phone, then the printed QR code I'd received through an encrypted email. It was a private invitation. He barely looked at it before scanning. It chirped green. "Right?" He forced a thin smile. "You may proceed." His dismissive glance was a prelude to the rejection I'd face inside, a reminder I was an outsider in their world. No welcome, no escort, just a subtle twitch of the eye, as if he were letting in someone who'd wandered in from the snow by mistake. The warmth inside hit like a wave, but it wasn't comforting. Marble floors glistened beneath my boots. Light from the chandeliers threw fractured rainbows on the walls. The air smelled like old money and new perfume. I walked slowly, quietly. The voices around me came in French, German, clipped English. People in velvet and satin whispered names like Currency, Basquiat, Warhol, O'Keeffe. I tried to melt into the corners. My mother used to tell me, "These places are for real people, Clara, not dreamers with paint-stained fingers." Her words echoed in my mind, a cruel mantra that had shaped my self-doubt. I spotted her before she spotted me. Margaret stood near the sculpture exhibit, laughing with two men and a woman draped in emerald silk. Eliza, my sister, was beside her, blonde waves cascading perfectly, voice rising just loud enough to seem spontaneous. She always knew how to make a room tilt in her favor. I looked away before she could see me. It didn't matter. I didn't come here for them. Whisper of Light would be in the main gallery near the center. The painting no one could stop talking about for weeks now. Estimated at over $5 million, 0 cents anonymous, rumored to be from a reclusive European master. I walked toward it, heart steady, heels tapping against cold stone. That's when I passed them. Margaret, still mid-conversation. One of the men turned slightly and nodded toward me. "Isn't that your daughter?" She glanced, then gave a short laugh. "She's just here to clean, maybe sweep up after the showing," another chuckled. "The help has taste now." There was a ripple of soft laughter, polite, dismissive, like I hadn't heard every word, but I had. The sting of her mockery was a fresh wound, confirming I'd never been more than a footnote in her eyes. My back didn't flinch, my steps didn't falter. Only my fingers tightened around the clutch until the seams dug into my skin. The gallery beyond was quieter. The lights dimmed there, focused like spotlights on the walls where the most prized pieces hung. Whisper of Light sat alone, framed in gold leaf, radiant in blue and ochre. From a distance it looked like a sunrise behind fog. colors bleeding into each other like breath against glass. People hovered around it, whispers carried. They say the artist's a genius from Vienna, trained under Holz at the Munich school, maybe even connected to Marianne Voss. I stood near the back, close enough to see the plaque. Artist unknown, just like that. My name gone. I had painted it over a year ago in a converted garage behind a second-hand bookstore. The materials were donated. I had layered the grief of a decade into that canvas, and now, here it hung, priceless and nameless. Or rather, stripped of the only name that should have mattered. The erasure of my identity was a deliberate act, a theft of my soul's work. A woman in a feathered wrap stepped beside me. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I hear the artist's in hiding. So mysterious." I said nothing, just watched her lean in to take a photo. She didn't know she stood beside the person who had painted that sky. I stepped to the far wall and sat on a narrow bench with no name tag, no reserved plaque, just silence and a bitter chill that clung to the lining of my dress. As the auction lights dimmed, a voice carried across the marble floor, sharp, incredulous. "That can't be who I think it is." It was my sister's voice. Eliza's voice sliced through the low murmur of the gallery like a shard of glass dropped on marble. "That can't be who I think it is." I didn't move, didn't turn, just kept my eyes on the floor tiles, pretending I hadn't heard her, pretending, maybe, that I wasn't me. The laugh that followed, hers high-pitched and knowing, wasn't loud, but it landed. Moments later, a man in a slim black vest approached, holding a sleek tablet like it made him important. "Excuse me, ma'am," he asked, bending slightly at the waist. "We've had a minor mix-up with seating. Would you follow me, please?" He said it with a smile practiced in mirrors, but his eyes never touched mine, just skimmed past me like he was still deciding if I belonged here at all. His request was another attempt to push me to the margins, reinforcing their narrative of my insignificance. I stood. The room moved in a rhythm I didn't recognize. Heels shifting, glasses clinking, a low hum of conversation thick with judgment. I followed him silently, weaving through rows of velvet ropes and leather chairs arranged in neat curves around the main gallery floor. We walked past rows of nameplates, Branson, Ellsworth, Van Dyck, and he led me farther and farther back until we reached a narrow aisle tucked behind a standing floral partition. It smelled faintly of peonies and air freshener. "This is you," he said, motioning to a chair wedged between a tall ficus and the swinging door to the side entrance where catering trays clattered every few minutes. I sat. There was no nameplate, no place card, nothing but a folding chair with a wrinkled cushion that wobbled slightly when I shifted. To my right, less than 4 feet away, was a polished brass sign, "Rest Room." Its reflection caught my eye. I could see myself in it, dimly warped, like a ghost someone forgot to polish away. Behind the divider, laughter swelled. The auction hadn't started yet, but the air was already electric. I could hear Eliza's voice. She had the kind of laugh that demanded attention. And she was talking fast, like someone in control of the spotlight. "She's sitting back there," someone whispered nearby. "Maybe she's staff," another voice offered. "She doesn't have a name tag." The words landed harder than I expected. I tried to smile just enough to seem unfazed, but it slid off my face before it reached my eyes. My hands found my lap. I smoothed the fabric of the forest green dress I'd thought was generous, a peace offering maybe. 3 nights ago, Eliza had shown up unannounced at the rental apartment I'd rented. She walked in like she owned the place, holding a garment bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "I figured you didn't have anything formal," she said, setting them both down. "This might help you blend in. It's tasteful, that's what you want, right?" She didn't wait for me to answer. She never did. Her false kindness was a trap, designed to make me feel inferior under the guise of generosity. The dress had fit well enough. It was elegant in a subdued way. Long sleeves, structured waist, neckline high but flattering. I'd spent half the night wondering if she was trying to reconnect, some kind of sisterly truce. But now she swept past my corner without looking at me, draped in the same shade of green, but hers shimmered, the fabric newer, cut sharper, paired with heels that clicked with intention. Her friends turned to her and laughed. One leaned in. "Oh my God, she actually wore it." Eliza smiled, tilted her head loud enough for everyone around to hear. She said, "Didn't think she'd take it seriously." And just like that, I understood. The dress wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was bait. I looked down at the cuff. A faint beige smudge near the seam caught my eye. Foundation. Probably hers. She'd worn this dress before, used it, tossed it to me like a costume for someone playing a role beneath her. A discarded thing, the kind you give away when you're done pretending to care. Her betrayal was a calculated move to diminish me, ensuring I'd remain in her shadow. I sat still, no fidgeting, no tears. But I stopped making eye contact, stopped adjusting my posture. My breathing got shallow, slow. I wrapped my hands tighter around the clutch in my lap, the same one I'd brought to every job interview, every exhibit, every opening where I was invited to observe, not participate. The crowd around me grew louder, more alive. Someone near the front popped a cork, and the soft hiss of champagne broke through the static in my mind. I didn't move. I couldn't. It wasn't the chair by the toilet. It wasn't even the dress. It was the realization, quiet, final, that nothing I had done or become changed how they saw me, not as an artist, not as a woman, not even as family. Then, as the lights dimmed for the opening bid, I turned slightly, just enough to see past the partition, and caught a glimpse of a framed photo near the gallery entrance. It was mounted above the welcome table, next to the list of tonight's contributors, and under a gilded light. My heart stuttered. I knew that photo, but not the way it looked now. The hum of anticipation melted into soft silence as the auction lights dimmed. My eyes caught a subtle gleam just beyond the partition near the entrance. A frame tilted beneath an overhead spotlight. I stood slowly. My heels made no sound against the marble as I weaved through people whose eyes barely registered me. I didn't care this time. Something about that photo, something about how it pulled at my chest, demanded I see it closer. It was mounted just above the welcome display where the donor names were printed on heavy cardstock and the staff's polished smiles pretended everything ran effortlessly. The frame was golden antique. The photo inside was large, carefully edited with the caption underneath reading, "Savannah, Summer 2013, a legacy of art and family." It stepped in closer. Recognition landed fast, then confusion swept in behind it. I knew this moment. I had lived it. The photo was from that week, back when we were all staying at the rented cottage, when the light in Georgia felt like it came from the earth itself, the week I painted Whisper of Light. I remembered the exact second the shutter clicked. I had stood to the left, clutching my easel, still smudged with ochre and blue. I had smiled reluctantly, sure, but it had been real, had belonged to that moment. But now I wasn't in it. There was a space where I should have been. The corner of an easel, still peeked into frame, and at the edge, barely visible, was my hand, just my hand. The rest was gone, cropped out so cleanly that someone had tried hard, but not hard enough. My throat tightened. That wasn't a mistake. That was deliberate. You don't accidentally erase a person from a family photo. You remove them when you want to rewrite the memory. The cropped photo was a brutal confirmation of their intent to obliterate my existence from their narrative. I stared at that ghost hand in the corner and realized they hadn't forgotten me. They'd rewritten the story and left me out on purpose. My presence had always been optional to them, something they could trim away when it ruined the composition. I backed away carefully and turned toward the gallery again. The lights remained low. A hush had fallen as the auctioneer prepared to speak. But I didn't return to my seat. I walked, calm, steady, toward the center of the room, toward Whisper of Light. It hung beneath a soft pool of light. From this distance, the colors looked alive, sweeps of golden brushwork layered over turbulent blue, like storm and sunrise trapped in a single breath. The kind of peace that demanded to be felt, not just seen. A man in a deep velvet jacket stood with a glass of white wine, muttering to a woman beside him. "They say it might break 25 million. Can you believe that?" She made a face. It's a mess of strokes. My niece paints like this when she's mad. Give a toddler a brush and a glass of Merlot. I stood a foot from them, said nothing. Another couple walked by. It's powerful, one murmured. But masculine, aggressive, the woman next to him scoffed. Probably some tortured European guy with a tragic backstory. I clenched the strap of my clutch tighter, anchoring myself in silence. No one here knew. They judged loudly because anonymity gave them freedom. Or maybe cruelty had always come naturally to this crowd. Then I heard her, Eliza's voice, the one I'd known since she first learned how to speak and figured out how to use that voice like a weapon. She strolled past the painting with a small entourage, champagne in hand, eyes amused. "It's good," she said, her tone deliberately generous, in a tortured kind of way. The artist was probably unstable. A soft wave of laughter followed her words. Her mockery was a personal attack, diminishing my pain to elevate her own status. I didn't move, but something inside me did. For the first time tonight, I looked around, not with hesitation, but with clarity. These weren't people admiring art. They were collecting names, price tags, ego currency. To them, Whisper of Light was a spectacle, not a soul. But what stung more than the stranger's mockery was Eliza's, and Mom's, and everyone else in that photo, smiling without me in it. They'd stood in front of my truth and laughed, and they didn't even know they were laughing at me. I should have turned away. I should have gone back behind that divider and sat in my chair next to the restroom and waited for the night to end. But I stayed. I stayed staring at Whisper of Light, feeling each stroke like an echo of a younger self. The girl who had painted this alone, barefoot on a dusty patio in Savannah, trying to make sense of the silence her family always gave her. And then I heard it again. Eliza just behind me, louder this time. "Whoever made this," she said with a sharp laugh, "needs help, not a gallery." My back stiffened, but I didn't turn around. Eliza's voice, layered with arrogance and laughter, carried easily across the room, but I kept my feet rooted near the base of the painting. The way she said it, like the artist needed therapy, not recognition, wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. I didn't need to face her to know her expression, the half-smile she wore when she knew she'd landed a blow no one else recognized as deliberate. She always had a talent for slicing with a sentence. The lights above flickered again, once, twice, and then fully dimmed as the auctioneer stepped onto the small platform at the front. The murmurs tapered off. People turned toward the stage, and I stepped away from Whisper of Light, blending into the fringes once more. I moved quietly, keeping to the periphery of the crowd, the way I had my entire life at family functions, present but never included. My chair behind the floral divider was still empty. No one had noticed I'd left it. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone with a crisp southern accent. "Before we begin tonight's extraordinary bidding for Whisper of Light, we'd like to invite a special guest to share a few words. Someone who's been deeply connected to the artist's journey." I blinked. No one had been connected to my journey, not since the summer I painted it alone, surrounded by strangers at the community center in Savannah. Then I saw her, Eliza. She rose from the front row, her forest green dress shimmering beneath the gallery lights. Not the one she had handed me 3 nights ago, the one I now sat, sweating in, but a modernized version. Tailored, sharper. She walked with confidence, as if this stage had always been hers. The room applauded lightly as she took the mic. Her voice was soft at first, intentional, measured. "This piece," she said, her hands sweeping gently toward the canvas behind her, "was born out of profound pain and healing. I had the privilege of being there for the artist during one of her darkest seasons. Her blatant lie was the theft of my suffering, claiming my pain as her own triumph." The audience stilled, drawn in. I watched her fight through that storm, and this work, Whisper of Light, is what came from it. Grief became movement, loss became form. I couldn't breathe. Eliza never knew what that season cost me. She never called, never visited the center, never asked where I had disappeared to when I left the family's summer rental early with a duffel bag and barely enough money for the bus. She was never there when I painted until my fingers bled using scraps and borrowed brushes under a flickering fluorescent light. But now, she was up there, speaking as if she midwifed it into being. She gestured toward the painting again, as though she were introducing her own child. "They say art is survival," she continued, "and I say it's proof of love, of sisterhood." Her false narrative was a dagger, twisting my deepest wounds into her spotlight moment. My nails dug into my palm. A part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to vanish entirely. What was worse, her theft of my work, or her theft of the grief it came from? They didn't just take my place, I thought, my eyes burning. They handed my voice to someone who never even had to whisper. The crowd began to applaud again, soft at first, then louder. I turned slowly and stepped back from the wall, navigating through the quiet gasps and tilted heads as the auctioneer resumed his place. Eliza smiled graciously as she stepped down. I couldn't let it continue. I moved to the edge of the gallery, where a young woman in black stood with a headset. Her clipboard rested at her side. "Excuse me," I said carefully, keeping my voice even. "That woman up there, Eliza, she didn't paint that piece." I did. She blinked at me, confused, then glanced at her list. "I'm sorry, do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but that painting, Whisper of Light, is mine." She smiled politely. "You'll want to speak with the event coordinator. I'm just managing the seating list tonight." I nodded tight-lipped and turned toward another staffer near the drinks table, a man in his 30s checking badges. "I need to speak with someone in charge," I told him. Painting was misrepresented. He looked at me for a beat, then shrugged. "If you have concerns about ownership, you'll need to take it up after the event. Maybe legal counsel." As I turned away, a guest nearby muttered to his companion, not quite quietly enough, "They'll let anyone claim genius these days." The crowd's disdain was a collective effort to silence me, echoing my family's dismissal. The words landed hard. I stopped, planted both feet, and stood still in the hallway, trying not to shake. I could feel my pulse in my ears. The dress itched at the neckline. My throat felt raw, but no tears came. I didn't cry anymore. Not for them. I almost walked out. Almost. I looked down the corridor toward the front doors, already halfway imagining the click of my boots across the snow outside. The cold would feel like truth, sharp, honest. "But then, Clara," the voice came from behind me, shaky, older, not Eliza, not anyone from the guest list I'd memorized. I turned, and it wasn't who I expected. I turned slowly, expecting one of the curators, maybe even a guest who had mistaken me for staff again, but it wasn't either. Standing just a few feet away was an elderly man, tall, wiry, with kind eyes behind thick glasses and a coat 2 decades out of fashion. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a folded scarf. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "But I knew Leonard Marsh, your mentor." The name struck me like a drop of warm water on a frozen pane. Leonard. I hadn't heard it aloud in years, not since the week he died, before I ever had the courage to show him the finished piece. I nodded slowly, unsure if I was supposed to speak or simply let the moment rest. "I'm Walter," the man continued. "I worked with Leonard. Studio assistant, sometimes just a guy who brought him coffee. He used to talk about you." Before I could reply, a young woman in a black blazer stepped toward us, carrying a clipboard and a subtle but rehearsed smile. "I'm sorry, miss," she said, her tone professional and firm. "You're not on the clearance list for this area. Would you mind coming with me?" I opened my mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Walter looked at me uncertain. "They're moving us to the overflow lounge," she said. "We've reached capacity." She didn't wait for a response. I followed her silently, Walter trailing behind. The overflow lounge was a narrow conference room down a corridor near the kitchen. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The walls were bare, save for a mounted TV showing the main auction room on a delayed feed. Folding chairs were lined up in uneven rows, half filled with forgotten names and low-tier patrons sipping watery wine from plastic cups. I sat down. Walter took the chair beside me, sighing softly. "They did the same thing to me when Leonard died," he muttered. "Said there wasn't enough space at the memorial. Made room for the press instead." His words mirrored my own exclusion, a painful parallel that strengthened my resolve. My hands rested in my lap. The screen in front of us displayed Eliza now, still glowing in that dress, smiling like she knew exactly how to command the room. They'd put me in a side room to watch my own life be paraded in front of strangers. "I know this isn't much," Walter said, reaching into his coat pocket, "but Leonard left something. Told me to give it to you if I ever saw you again. And you looked like you were about to vanish." He handed me a small flash drive, plain, no label. I blinked at it for a moment. My fingers moved without thought, reaching for my phone and the small adapter I carried for sketch files. It took a second to load, the screen flickering before an old video began. The lighting was dim, just Leonard's studio lamp casting shadows on his thinning hair. He looked tired. His voice, though, was steady. "If they erase your name, let the work speak," he said. "But don't disappear. Your voice matters more than their walls." He smiled. Faint, but real. Art was never about approval, Clara. It was about presence. Keep showing up. The video ended. I stared at the screen a moment longer, not crying, just breathing through the weight of being seen again, even if only through a recording. "That voice," I whispered. He was the only one who ever called me an artist without laughing. Walter gave a soft nod. He believed in you, fiercely. The screen up front cut to the auctioneer announcing the opening bid. I couldn't hear his exact words through the static, but the number flashed on the bottom. Whisper of Light was being sold. My feet moved before I gave them permission. I stood up, stepped out of the room. Walter didn't stop me. No one did. I walked down the hallway, past the kitchen, past the coat check, past the clinking glasses and quiet gasps of high society. Outside, the cold greeted me like an old friend. Wind lifted the hem of my coat, tugging at the threads along the seam. Across the street, the Bourbon Building stood glowing against the snowy evening, golden light spilling from its tall windows. I stopped at the edge of the valet line. Around me, people chatted about the lot numbers, the champagne, the southern cheese. They had no idea what it had cost to make the thing they were bidding on. I thought about walking away. It would have been easier, clean, but then I reached into my clutch, maybe to grab my phone, maybe just to fidget, and my fingers brushed something I hadn't remembered placing inside. A piece of paper. I pulled it out. Folded thick stock, familiar texture. When I opened it, I saw the original sketch of Whisper of Light, the one I drew at the center that first night. And there, beneath the lines, was my name. My full name scrawled in graph, Clara Bennett. Leonard must have tucked it in before he died. Quiet, intentional, like him. I stared at the sketch for a long moment. Then I looked back at the glowing building. I turned around, clutched tight in hand. "Not yet," I whispered to the wind. "You don't get to keep my silence." I stepped back inside. The cold from outside still clung to me, but something inside had shifted. There was no rush in my walk, no tremble in my spine. Not revenge, not even anger, just something sharper, cleaner, like light after a long blink. I walked through the corridor quietly, past the velvet ropes, past the conversations about vintages and valuations, and slipped into the main viewing room again. No one noticed. No one stopped me. The lights were softer now, focused on the stage where the auctioneer stood poised like a conductor, baton in hand, voice crisp and proud. "And now," he announced, "lot number 71, Whisper of Light." I took a seat at the back near the service entrance, half shielded by a column, still holding the folded sketch, now creased by my grip. "Opening at $1 million, 0 cents, he said, and just like that, the room stirred. Hands rose without hesitation. Paddles marked with family crests, tech emblems, diamond insignias. People I didn't know raising prices on what I had painted with trembling hands in the dark, with borrowed light and broken brushes. A billionaire from Houston offered $1,300,000. 0 cents. A hedge fund couple countered. A woman in pearls whispered something and signaled 1.5. The room buzzed. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my paddle. It was nothing fancy, paperboard, slightly bent at the corner, but it had been assigned to me when I first entered, along with a courtesy guest badge no one had respected. I raised it calm, straight. Not even 2 seconds passed before a staffer in a sharp gray blazer hurried over. "Excuse me, miss," he said, "just loud enough to draw attention. I'll need you to lower it." People near me turned. Someone snickered. "I'm sorry," I asked, still holding at aloft. "You're not authorized to bid," he repeated, this time with a tighter smile. "Please lower your paddle or we'll have to revoke your guest privileges." I lowered my hand slowly, like I was putting down a blade. Chuckles rippled again. The auctioneer didn't pause. He called for $2 million. 0 cents. My face didn't burn, not anymore. I had already run out of space for shame. Instead, I turned to the man who'd spoken and said, "I'd like to see the documentation of provenance, please." He blinked. I don't handle that directly." "Then find someone who does." He hesitated. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was something in my eyes. But he nodded and disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was accompanied by a polished young woman with a binder in hand. She offered me a practiced grin. "The file includes the artist's background narrative and certificate of authenticity," she said, "though I'm afraid guests aren't typically granted access to those." "I'm the artist," I said, not raising my voice. The woman blinked. I held her gaze until she handed the folder over. Inside, glossy printed pages, curated lines about loss and courage. At the bottom of the certificate, just below the reproduction of Whisper of Light, was a signature. But it wasn't mine. It was close, but it was Eliza's handwriting shaped to mimic mine. And beneath it, inspired by the guidance of Eliza Bennett. I felt my jaw tighten. Every nerve went still. Not only had they stolen the work, they'd rewritten it, reassigned my grief to someone else's resume. My brushstroke, my breakdown, my healing, turned into a marketing device for the woman who once told me I should stick to teaching. The forged signature was the ultimate betrayal, a calculated theft of my legacy. I looked up. The bidding had climbed to $2.9 million. Eliza was now standing near the front, smiling toward the audience as if she were the bride in a wedding she didn't attend the rehearsal for. Another paddle rose. $3 million. 0 cents. Then she turned and waved to someone near the back of the room, a man from Miami by the accent. He lifted his hand slightly, acknowledging her, like an old friend, and in that moment, the flash of a camera went off. Eliza posed just beneath my painting, her hand lightly touching the corner of the frame like she was blessing it. My fingers lost grip of the paddle. It clattered to the floor, and the sound, small but sharp, cut through the room like a dropped crystal glass. Heads turned. A woman 2 rows ahead leaned toward her companion and whispered not softly, "Is she still here? God, give it up already. She looks like she came to refill the wine." Laughter flickered around her, like sparks catching in a dry field. I didn't move. I sat still, hands folded, chin high. But something inside had snapped. Not in rage, but in silence. That kind of silence that grows teeth. I inhaled through my nose, looked once more at the stage. The auctioneer raised his hand. Going once, the room hushed. Going twice. Eliza smiled like a queen with the crown already on her head, and I stood. No words, just one step forward. And every head turned. The sound of my heels echoed with every step I took across the marble, slicing cleanly through the murmurs and shifting stares. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I didn't even acknowledge the ripple of whispers that followed my stride. I walked as if I belonged, because deep down, even after everything, I knew I did. My eyes stayed locked on Whisper of Light, its fractured light and aching shadows. The brush strokes that had once bled from my fingers during nights no one in this room cared to imagine. It wasn't just a painting. It was a memory sealed in pigment, and they were trying to sell it like it was a pretty thing someone else discovered. When I reached the front, I didn't speak. I didn't raise a finger. I simply reached into my clutch and unfolded the paper that had been tucked inside. Creased now, but clear. The original sketch, the raw concept of Whisper of Light, drawn in charcoal on cheap artist stock, signed in my full name with the date and time I'd scrawled on the back. Savannah, Community Center, 214 Iaming. I placed it gently on the podium beside the auctioneer. He looked confused at first, then curious. The room tensed. One of the gallery assistants leaned in to peer at it. Another whispered something into a small headset. A beat later, the projector above flashed the image onto the massive white wall behind me, and then there was silence. No rustle of silk, no clinking of glasses, nothing. Just the stark sketch in charcoal, raw, bruised, and real. Unmistakably mine. "You may not know me," I said softly, stepping closer to the mic. My voice, "but my work has been standing in this room long before you let me in." I didn't turn to face them. I stayed where I was, speaking to the canvas, to the echo of myself inside it. Behind me I heard movement, heels sharp, too quick. "Stop!" Eliza's voice broke through the stillness. "She's lying!" Gasps, then a pause. "She's just trying to embarrass us. That sketch, it could be faked. You don't know her. You don't know what she's like." A man near the projector replied. "Metadata confirms timestamp. It matches archival submissions logged under the private sketch archive at Marsh Trust." Eliza whipped around. "Mother, tell them. Tell them it was inspired by me. That I helped." But Margaret didn't speak. She didn't move. She sat with her fingers clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on a glass of untouched water. Eliza's lips trembled. "You told me to, but—" She stopped herself. No one came to her defense. The room had shifted. I turned then, finally, slowly facing them. No rage, no speech, just the truth sitting at my feet and on the wall behind me. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Miss Bennett, would you like us to continue the sale?" I looked at him, then at Eliza, who was visibly shaking, mascara threatening to run. I glanced once more at the sketch, the signature, the timestamp, the night it was born, and I said, "No, I didn't come here to sell my name. I came to take it back." A hush rolled over the room, this one heavier than before. There was no longer curiosity in their faces. There was recognition. Some lowered their eyes, some nodded. The auctioneer adjusted his microphone, slowly stepping back. And just as I began to gather the sketch from the podium, someone else moved. From the edge of the crowd, a silhouette emerged, calm, poised, and deliberate. Margaret. In her hand, a manila envelope, stamped, sealed, and headed straight for me. Margaret didn't rush. She glided through the hush of the gallery like someone used to owning the floor. The manila envelope in her hand looked too plain to carry what I already knew was another twist of the knife. I turned toward her, not flinching, not afraid, just ready. The auctioneer stood still, uncertain whether to acknowledge her or wave security over, but she bypassed me entirely and offered the envelope directly to him. "There's a matter of clarification," she said, her voice smooth as aged bourbon. "This document pertains to the legal ownership of the work being discussed." The auctioneer, cautious, opened it slowly. The contents rustled. I could feel the weight of the room shift again. How quickly the air changes when power walks in, wearing pearls. He skimmed the contents, paused, then read aloud. "Notarized deed of ownership for the physical work Whisper of Light, filed under Bennett Holdings, LLC. Eliza Bennett listed as sole authorized custodian." Her legal maneuver was a desperate attempt to maintain control, but it only exposed their deceit further. A buzz spread like wildfire. People leaned into one another. Phones lifted. Then came Margaret's voice again, this time slightly sharper. "My daughter Eliza financed the framing, the shipping, the presentation, and the handling fees. All of it. The painting is ours in every way that matters. The words felt rehearsed and cold. She turned to me then, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You can keep the romance, darling, but art without backing is just a hobby. Someone from the media team whispered just loud enough. This just turned nuclear. I stood frozen, not in shock, not anymore, but in the same stillness that comes when you finally realize the storm was never about the wind, but who kept pushing you into it. Margaret tilted her chin. You can call yourself the artist, Clara, but artists still need patrons, and you've never been good at asking for help. Her condescension was a final blow, but it ignited my defiance. I didn't respond, not yet. Instead, I reached again into my clutch, my fingers brushing past the same sketch that had silenced the room minutes ago, but this time, I pulled out a folded letter, creased at the corners, my mentor's handwriting etched across the front, and tucked with it a small flash drive. I walked to the same podium where the auctioneer stood frozen beside his microphone. This letter, I said calmly, was written and signed by Leonard Marsh, my mentor, dated 3 months before Bennett Holdings even existed. He verified Whisper of Light as mine, not inspired by, not co-created, mine. I passed the letter to the auctioneer, then turned to the press huddled near the side wall. And this, I said, holding up the flash drive, contains every sketch, every thumbnail, every voice note and brush test, all time-stamped, all in my name. The cameras clicked faster now. The media leaned in. I placed the flash drive into the hand of a woman from the New Orleans Times and simply said, "Make it public." Gasps turned into murmurs. Eliza stood again. "This is ridiculous! It's slander! She's bitter! She's jealous because she never had enough," I said. Not a shout, not a plea, just a statement, and it sliced through her monologue like glass through silk. Then I stepped in front of the painting, not beside it, not in its shadow. "I painted Whisper of Light when I was sleeping on floorboards," I said, my voice steadier than even I expected. Not for profit, not for applause, but because I needed air, and this was the only way I knew how to breathe. I looked toward the crowd, faces that once dismissed me now watching with stunned focus. "This canvas may legally belong to you," I continued, eyes briefly flicking to Margaret and Eliza. "But this work, its story, its pain, its breath is mine. You can keep the walls. You'll never own what lived inside them." Then, without waiting for another insult or defense, I turned. I could feel their silence behind me, thicker than before. And as I reached the tall glass doors of Bourbon, I heard it, not for Whisper of Light, but for the peace that followed it. The auctioneer's gavel dropped, and I kept walking. The doors behind me closed with a quiet finality, and the gavel cracked against the auctioneer's podium. I didn't look back. That sound, once the echo of power, no longer held me hostage. It rang out, yes, but not for me, not for my painting. Snow was falling harder now, soft and slow, like the air itself was exhaling. I stepped down the marble staircase of the Bourbon auction house, each footfall firmer than the last. My breath curled visibly in the cold. New Orleans at night never looked warmer than it did right then. I reached into my coat pocket, not for my phone. I hadn't checked it all night, though I could feel the vibrations humming against my leg. Over 100 notifications, missed calls, unknown numbers, but I didn't look. What I reached for instead was the silver ring. It had been tucked inside my clutch before I entered that building. I hadn't wanted it seen, hadn't wanted me seen, not as I was. But now, in the cool outside light, I slid it back onto my finger. The way it settled on my skin felt like something returning home. That ring had been a quiet anchor since I was 18. My father gave it to me before he passed. He didn't say much, but when he handed it over, he'd simply said, "Paint whatever they say, you shouldn't. That's how I'll know it's you." And now I had. In the days that followed, I watched the world shift. Not with fanfare, not with fury, but with precision. Bennett family fraud allegations surface auction house under scrutiny for artist erasure. Anonymous sketch stuns industry with viral truth. Eliza's sponsorships vanished faster than a summer storm. Magazines quietly pulled her photo spreads. One podcast episode she appeared on was edited retroactively to focus on the art, not the hype. Margaret stepped down from her position on the Board of Arts Education. Not because she was fired. No, they issued a polite thank you email and a commemorative plaque. But the silence around her was louder than any resignation speech could have been. Donors stopped returning calls. Patrons looked elsewhere. There were no dramatic headlines screaming for blood, just absence, and for people like them, silence was the cruelest punishment of all. Weeks later, I moved to Savannah. I didn't plan it, I just came for the ocean and never left. Tucked between a family-owned coffee shop and a guitar repair shop, I opened a modest gallery with exposed brick walls and chipped white trim. No spotlights, no velvet ropes, just daylight, wood floors, and open space. Admission was free. None of the paintings were signed. If people asked whose work hung on the walls, the volunteers would simply shrug and say, "Depends on which brushstroke you're looking at." Most didn't ask, but some did. The back of the gallery opened into what used to be a storage space. I converted it into a studio, where kids dipped fingers in paint and older folks sipped coffee while sketching faces that reminded them of someone they lost. On a faded chalkboard scrolled in uneven handwriting, I'd written, "The walls never ask if you belong. They just hold whatever you're brave enough to hang." I lived quietly, not invisibly, just intentionally. I didn't seek out interviews, I didn't need applause. The story had already been told, and the people who needed to hear it had heard it. That was enough. One afternoon, as I restocked some brushes in the back, I heard the soft gasp of a visitor near the entrance. When I stepped around the corner, I saw her, a woman about 12 years older than I'd been when I painted Whisper of Light. She stood frozen in front of a display case near the entrance. Inside was the original sketch, the same one I'd laid on the podium that night. Beside it sat a small velvet box, the ring. A brass plaque was mounted just below it. No dates, no titles, just a sentence to the one who saw color where others saw mess. That line had come from Leonard long before any of this began. The woman turned to me, misty-eyed. "Did you write that?" I smiled, shaking my head. "No, but I earned it." She nodded once, then looked away like she needed a moment. People sometimes did. Later that day, I was painting in the back. A quiet afternoon, sun pouring through the dusty skylight. Soft music playing from someone's phone. A little girl wandered in. Couldn't have been more than 8. She stopped in front of the canvas I was working on, tilted her head and asked, "Who made this?" I didn't hesitate. I smiled and said, "Someone who used to be quiet." She nodded, then walked on. And that was that. I no longer needed them to say my name. My name was in the breath behind every line, the silence between colors, the space that art creates when no one's shouting over it. Some silences don't mean surrender. Some silences are brushstrokes waiting to be seen.